Celeste Laurent and her elite model clique ruled the runway until they made one fatal mistake, humiliating Big Shaq's wife, Shawnee Henderson, right in front of him. What they didn't realize? The man they just disrespected doesn't just attend these shows, he owns the industry. And by the time the truth hits, their glamorous world will come crashing down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city skyline stretched like an endless painting outside the venue's glass walls, the glow of flashing cameras reflecting off the polished marble floors. Tonight was the night, the Orion Fashion Gala, where only the elite of the elite stepped foot. It wasn't just a fashion event, it was a battlefield of status, wealth, and influence. Inside, the air carried an intoxicating mix of expensive perfumes and quiet arrogance. Diamonds glistened under chandeliers, and couture gowns shimmered under the spotlights. Models, socialites, and designers mingled in carefully curated circles, exchanging air kisses and empty pleasantries. And then, she walked in. Shawnee Henderson. She wasn't draped in avant-garde fabric or wrapped in a scandalous silhouette. No, she walked with effortless grace in an understated yet undeniably elegant custom-tailored dress, one that spoke of class, not desperation. She didn't need the approval of the room, yet the room noticed her anyway. And they hated that. "That's her?" a voice murmured. A group of models, their features sharp and their gazes sharper, stood near the grand staircase, their champagne flutes barely concealing their smirks. Among them, Celeste Laurent, the reigning queen of the runway, a woman with cheekbones like daggers and a reputation just as lethal. She barely tilted her head as her lips curled. "Oh, please. She looks like she walked in by accident." A soft chuckle rippled through the group. Shawnee felt the weight of their gazes, the silent scrutiny of women who had spent their entire lives believing they were the main characters. And in their world, she wasn't even an extra. Still, she kept walking. She had nothing to prove, nothing to fight for. At least, not yet. The event was in full swing, but Shawnee had no illusions. This wasn't a celebration, it was a jungle, where survival meant outshining the person next to you. She could feel it in the way people studied her, dissecting her every move like she was an exhibit at a museum they didn't quite understand. By the champagne bar, a designer with slicked back hair and a too-tight smile leaned toward Celeste. How does a woman like that end up here? Celeste didn't bother lowering her voice. She married well. A few gasps, some stifled laughter. Shawnee's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but she didn't turn. They wanted a reaction. They weren't going to get one. "I mean," another model, Annabelle, chimed in, twirling her diamond bracelet. "Isn't it cute? The whole lucky girl aesthetic? One day she's, a basketball wife? Next thing you know, she's sitting front row at a show she shouldn't even be invited to." Shawnee exhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. She knew women like this. She had met their kind before. Their cruelty wasn't personal. It was reflex. They were raised in an industry that taught them kindness was weakness and status was a sport. But that didn't make it hurt any less. Across the room, Shaq watched. His face gave away nothing, but his eyes? They missed nothing. As the show began, the models took their places, their gowns flowing as they strutted down the runway. Every movement was designed to exude power, exclusivity, control. And for a while, it worked. Until Shawnee became the conversation again. Celeste and Annabelle, seated at the VIP table, weren't done yet. "You know," Celeste mused loudly, fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, "this industry is built on legacy, talent, blood, sweat, and tears. Not convenience." Annabelle grinned. "I'm just saying, if my career was built on my last name instead of my talent, I'd keep a lower profile." This time, Shawnee did turn. And when she locked eyes with Celeste, the room shifted. For the first time all night, Celeste felt something foreign. Doubt. Shawnee had the kind of presence that didn't need words. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to play their game. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Funny. It wasn't Shawnee. It was Shaq. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to make people hold their breath, straighten their backs, rethink their choices. Slowly, he walked toward the table, the weight of his footsteps louder than any insult thrown that night. Celeste stiffened. "You were saying?" Shaq's tone was even, casual, which made it so much worse. Celeste opened her mouth and closed it. She had spent years, being the predator, the one who dictated who was in and who was out. But now, she wasn't in control anymore. Shaq glanced at Shawnee, then at the table of models, and finally, at the event organizer, who had been conveniently ignoring the situation until now. "Tell me something," Shaq continued. "How much does this event cost to run?" The organizer, a man who prided himself on being unfazed, swallowed hard. Mr. O'Neill." "Because I'm wondering," Shaq interrupted smoothly, "if the investors knew that their talent," his gaze cut to Celeste, "spends their time humiliating guests instead of doing their job." Silence. Thick, merciless silence. Celeste's stomach dropped. The whispers started before she could even process what had happened. Wait, investors? And then it hit her. Oh no. Shaq wasn't just a guest. He was funding this. Her breath hitched. The realization settled like cement in her chest. Shawnee didn't have to lift a finger. She didn't need to clap back. Because Celeste had just insulted the man who controlled the very world she thrived in. And she wasn't laughing anymore. The show continued, but the air was different. Every glance toward Shawnee now carried a mix of fear, respect, and something else. Regret. Celeste tried to recover, but the damage was done. By the time the night ended, murmurs of contracts being questioned, endorsements reconsidered, and reputations crumbling were already making their way through the industry. Shawnee, meanwhile, didn't need to say a word. She simply smiled, because they had played their game, and lost. Badly. The night was moving fast, flashing cameras, clinking champagne glasses, and the endless rustle of designer gowns swishing across marble floors. It was a world built on illusion, where power wasn't in how you carried yourself, but in how you made others feel small. And no one mastered that game better than Celeste Laurent. Celeste had ruled this industry for a decade. Her walk was legendary, her name carried weight, and her influence could make or break careers overnight. She wasn't just a model, she was the standard. People followed her lead, whether out of admiration or fear. And tonight, she had found her next target, Shawnee Henderson. Shawnee had done nothing to invite this attention. Nothing except exist in a space where Celeste decided she didn't belong. It started with whispers, the kind that slithered between designer-clad bodies, soft enough to be deniable, loud enough to be heard. "God, look at that dress. Who even made that? I think it's custom. Must be nice to have someone else's bank account fund your wardrobe." A small, cruel laugh followed. The kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be funny. It was meant to be sharp. Meant to pierce. Shawnee felt the sting, but she didn't turn. She knew this game. She had grown up around women like this, the ones who thrived on insecurity, who saw kindness as weakness, who needed someone beneath them to feel taller. Still, the words chipped away, little daggers carving into her confidence. Celeste, sensing Shawnee's silence, smirked. This was too easy. She lifted her champagne flute, let the bubbles swirl, and then, the kill shot. She's what happens when a rich man gets bored and marries his maid. For a second, it was as if the entire room exhaled at once. And then, the laughter. Sharp, loud, effortless. The kind of laugh that didn't just mock, but confirmed power. Because if enough people laughed, it became the truth. Shawnee froze. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't let her face betray the absolute humiliation searing through her veins like fire. But inside, it burned. Not because she cared what Celeste thought, not because the insult was clever, but because no one said a word to stop it. The audience, the stylists, the designers, the photographers, they all pretended not to hear. Because no one challenged Celeste Laurent. And that's when Shawnee felt it. the deep, cutting loneliness of being surrounded by people, yet completely alone. Across the room, Shaq wasn't laughing. He stood near the edge of the event, hands in his pockets, watching everything unfold. His face was unreadable, but his eyes? Cold, calculated, unamused. Shaq had never cared about this world, the fake smiles, the fragile egos, the power plays. He had built himself into an empire without their approval, without their validation. But what he did care about? Respect. And Shawnee was his wife. Celeste and her clique didn't know it yet, but they had just made the worst mistake of their careers. Not because Shaq was going to yell, not because he would cause a scene. That wasn't his style. No, they just humiliated themselves in front of the man who owned the very industry they thrived in, and they had no idea. Shawnee inhaled slowly, forcing composure, refusing to give Celeste the satisfaction of a reaction. The air around her felt heavier, suffocating in the way only a room full of people pretending not to see you could. Celeste, sensing Shawnee's silence, smirked. This was too easy. She lifted her champagne flute, let the bubbles swirl, and then the kill shot. She's what happens when a rich man gets bored and marries his maid. For a second, it was as if the entire room exhaled at once. And then, the laughter. Sharp, loud, effortless. The kind of laugh that didn't just mock, but confirmed power. Because if enough people laughed, it became the truth. Shawnee froze. She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't let her face betray the absolute humiliation searing through her veins like fire. But inside, it burned. Not because she cared what Celeste thought. Not because the insult was clever. But because no one said a word to stop it. The audience, the stylists, the designers, the photographers, they all pretended not to hear. Because no one challenged Celeste Laurent. And that's when Shawnee felt it. The deep, cutting loneliness of being surrounded by people, yet completely alone. Across the room, Shaq wasn't laughing. He stood near the edge of the event, hands in his pockets, watching everything unfold. His face was unreadable, but his eyes? Cold, calculated, unamused. Shaq had never cared about this world. The fake smiles, the fragile egos, the power plays. He had built himself into an empire without their approval, without their validation. But what he did care about? Respect. And Shawnee was his wife. Celeste and her clique didn't know it yet, but they had just made the worst mistake of their careers. Not because Shaq was going to yell, not because he would cause a scene. That wasn't his style. No. They just humiliated themselves in front of the man who owned the very industry they thrived in. And they had no idea. Shawnee inhaled slowly, forcing composure, refusing to give Celeste the satisfaction of a reaction. The air around her felt heavier, suffocating in the way only a room full of people pretending not to see you could. Celeste, sensing her victory, leaned back in her seat, crossing her long legs with the kind of ease that said, "I own this place." "I mean, no offense," she added, tilting her head in mock sympathy. "You're pretty in a natural kind of way." Another quiet chuckle. Shawnee's jaw tightened, but she still didn't speak, and that made it worse. Celeste wanted her to break. She wanted to see a flicker of embarrassment, a crack in the armor. Because that's how you kept your throne in this world. You didn't just win. You crushed. You erased. You made sure they never tried to step into your world again. The tension at the table grew suffocating. Shawnee's silence wasn't weakness. It was defiance. And that pissed Celeste off. Shaq had seen enough. He didn't react immediately. No sudden movements. Control was power. Silence was lethal. He took a slow sip of his drink, watching as Celeste dug her own grave without even realizing it. Because that's the thing about people like her. They never look up. They spend so much time looking down on others that they never stop to wonder who's looking down on them. Shaq turned slightly to the side, signaling one of the event coordinators with a subtle nod. No words exchanged, no dramatic gestures. Just a look. A shift was coming. And Celeste wasn't ready. As the evening continued, whispers started filtering through the room. First, just a few. then more. The models who had been laughing with Celeste suddenly weren't laughing anymore. Some were checking their phones, their faces dropping. Something was happening. Shawnee noticed it too. The atmosphere had changed, like a storm brewing in the distance. Then finally, Celeste saw it. A message on her phone. Her breath hitched. Her biggest sponsor, Axel Cosmetics, had just dropped her. For a second, the world tilted. Then another text. Her agency had scheduled an urgent meeting, one she hadn't asked for. Her heart slammed against her ribs. What the hell was happening? She looked up, eyes darting around the room, and that's when she saw him. Shaq, standing across the room, watching, expression unreadable. And suddenly, it all clicked. The unspoken warning Celeste's stomach dropped. Shaq hadn't needed to say a word. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't put her in her place the way she had expected. He simply let her dig her own grave, and then let the world watch her fall into it. The laughter from earlier, the smug confidence, gone. And Shawnee, still standing, unbothered, because Celeste had never been the powerful one here. She just didn't realize it until it was too late. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Shaquille O'Neal had never been the kind of man who needed to announce his presence. His size alone made him impossible to ignore, but it wasn't just that. It was his energy. He was a storm that never rushed, a presence that never begged to be acknowledged, but always was. People often mistook his silence for passivity. That was their mistake. Because Shaq never reacted. He calculated. And tonight, as he stood in the shadows of the Orion Fashion Gala, watching his wife be humiliated by a pack of desperate, ego-drunk models, he felt something stir deep inside him. Not anger, not outrage. Something colder. Something far more dangerous. The people in this room thought they understood power. They thought it lived in magazine covers, exclusive brand deals, and the ability to reduce another person's worth with a well-placed insult. They thought power was Celeste Laurent, sitting on her self-built throne, controlling who was in and who was out. But Shaq had lived through real power struggles, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. He let his mind drift back, just for a moment, to a time when no one had known his name, when no one had listened, when he had been underestimated, when they had told him he would never be enough. He had grown up in the rougher parts of Newark, New Jersey, where respect wasn't given. It was taken, earned, fought for. Money had been tight, options even tighter, and the world had been quick to remind him that kids like him, they didn't make it. He was too big, too slow, too different. Teachers said he would never amount to anything. Scouts overlooked him in favor of flashier, skinnier, more polished players. They told him he didn't have the finesse, the charm, the pedigree to be great. He had smiled through it all, filed every insult away in the back of his mind like bullets in a loaded chamber. And then, he proved them all wrong. One game at a time, one season at a time. He became unstoppable. And when the money came, he didn't waste it on temporary luxuries. No, he invested. He built. He turned his name into a brand, then an empire. Billionaire, mogul, investor. And still, after everything, people still made the mistake of underestimating him, just like Celeste and her clique had done tonight. Shaq took another slow sip of his drink, gaze locked onto the woman who had dared to belittle his wife. Celeste sat comfortably at the table, basking in her own perceived invincibility, unaware that her world was already beginning to crumble. He didn't need to move. He didn't need to speak. Power wasn't about reacting. It was about making them regret. And oh, she was going to regret this. Shawnee sat stiffly at her table, fingers grazing the stem of her wineglass. She wasn't a weak woman. She had fought her own battles, carved her own space in the world, stood beside Shaq not as his shadow, but as his equal. But even she wasn't immune to this kind of cruelty. Shaq knew that look on her face, the tightness in her jaw, the way she refused to blink too much, as if willing herself not to show even a flicker of emotion. She wasn't broken, but she was hurt. And that was unacceptable. Shaq's fingers twitched at his side, the only external hint of the cold, simmering storm building inside him. Celeste Laurent had made a fatal error tonight. She had assumed she was untouchable. She had assumed her world was too powerful, too impenetrable, too out of reach for a man like him to shake it. And that mistake? That was going to cost her everything. Shaq didn't call for security, didn't cause a scene. That wasn't how real power worked. Instead, he shifted slightly, catching the eye of Paul Whitman, one of the key investors of the event. Paul had known Shaq for years, had done business with him, and, more importantly, owed him favors. Shaq gave a single nod. Paul hesitated only for a moment before nodding back and immediately excusing himself from his conversation. A single text was sent. A domino had been tipped. Shaq exhaled slowly. This wasn't about making Celeste apologize. He didn't care for apologies. This was about reminding them that power wasn't about who spoke the loudest. It was about who controlled the room, even in silence. Celeste continued her victory lap, smiling as the models around her laughed, completely unaware that the mood in the venue was beginning to shift. A few designers started whispering. A couple of agents checked their phones, frowning. The energy in the room changed, so subtle that only those who understood real power noticed it immediately. Shaq watched as Celeste's laughter faltered just slightly. Good. Let her feel it. Let her feel the weight of something coming. Something she couldn't control. Something she didn't even understand yet. A few feet away, an event organizer whispered urgently into a model's ear. Celeste's modeling agency sent a second email, one she hadn't seen yet. Axel Cosmetics, one of her biggest sponsors, had just put her contract under review. She didn't know it yet, but soon, she would. And then, the reality of her situation would hit her, because the thing about power was that when it shifted, it didn't announce itself. It didn't warn you. It just happened. Celeste had spent her whole career treating people like stepping stones. Tonight, she had just tripped on the wrong one. Shaq leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, gaze steady. He didn't need to say a word, because Celeste, she was already beginning to feel it. The slow, creeping realization that something had changed, that the air in the room was different, that the people who had laughed with her minutes ago were now watching her carefully, hesitating, second-guessing. She didn't know why yet, but soon she would. And by then, it would be too late. Shaq glanced at Shawnee, his wife still sitting tall, still refusing to let the sting of humiliation show on her face. She didn't know what he had done. Didn't know that in the span of a single hour, he had set things in motion that would turn Celeste's world upside down. And she wouldn't know. Because true power doesn't gloat. True power just moves. Shaq took one last sip of his drink. By tomorrow morning, Celeste Laurent would wake up in a different world. One where she was no longer the queen of anything, and she would never see it coming. Backstage was a different world. The polished, pristine elegance of the runway didn't extend beyond the velvet curtains. Here the air was thick with perfume, hairspray, and the unspoken hunger for relevance. Models lounged on velvet couches, legs crossed, posture effortlessly superior. Celeste Laurent sat at the center of it all, draped in an attitude that reeked of entitlement. She was in her element, surrounded by a carefully curated circle of models who fed off her energy. Women who knew that survival in this industry meant attaching yourself to power. And Celeste? She was power. Or at least she thought so. Annabelle, her right-hand enabler, leaned in close, tilting her phone screen toward Celeste. Comments are rolling in already, she smirked. That little moment back there? Pure gold. Social media's eating it up. Celeste scanned the screen, eyes skimming over the mocking posts, snide memes, and indirect jabs at Shawnee Henderson. Told you, Celeste exhaled smoothly, tossing her platinum hair over her shoulder. By tomorrow, nobody's going to remember that woman. A ripple of laughter spread through the room. They had done this before. Destroyed careers with a whisper. Made people disappear from the industry without lifting a finger. This was just another night, another casualty. Or so they thought. Elsewhere in the venue, Shaq was still. Calm. Watchful. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. Because true power doesn't rush. It moves at its own pace, knowing it controls the board. He took his time, phone resting in his palm, the weight of decades of connections at his fingertips. One call, one email, one shift in loyalty. That's all it took to turn a person into a footnote in their own story. Shaq's contacts weren't just names in his phone. They were decision makers. People who owed him. People who respected him. People who never ignored his calls. And tonight, he was making those calls. The first went out to Axel Cosmetics. A quiet, deliberate conversation. The second to Avant magazine. A simple inquiry. The third? That one was the most important. A conversation with the most powerful modeling agency in the country. An agency Celeste was bound to. An agency that didn't tolerate negative press. By the time he hung up, the first crack had appeared. Celeste just didn't know it yet. Backstage, the laughter continued. Annabelle refreshed her screen, grinning as more comments rolled in. They're saying she looked like she was seconds away from crying. Celeste smirked. Please. She's lucky I even acknowledged her. More laughter, more clinking glasses. They were so focused on celebrating a victory that didn't exist, they failed to notice the subtle shift happening around them. The whispers had started. A stylist walked in, eyes darting nervously as she muttered something to another assistant. A manager furrowed his brows at his phone screen. A makeup artist, mid-touch-up, suddenly went rigid, lips pressed into a thin line as she read a message on her smartwatch. It was small, unnoticeable to the untrained eye. But the cracks were forming. And Shaq? He was simply waiting for the floor beneath them to cave in. Celeste, still reveling in her perceived dominance, finally noticed the shift. She frowned. Why is everyone acting weird? Annabelle, still glued to her phone, barely glanced up. Dunno. Probably nothing. But then, her phone buzzed again. And this time she actually read the message. Her smirk faded. Celeste noticed immediately. What? Annabelle hesitated, fingers gripping the device tighter. I'm sure it's a mistake. Celeste grabbed the phone. Her own name was trending now, but not the way she wanted. The headline punched her in the gut. Celeste Laurent under fire after publicly mocking Shawnee Henderson. Major brands begin cutting ties. Her breath caught. What the hell? She scrolled frantically, trying to understand, but the damage had already been done. Axel Cosmetics had pulled their latest campaign featuring her. Avant magazine had removed her from next month's cover. Her modeling agency had released a formal statement distancing themselves from her behavior. She stopped breathing for a second. Annabelle's voice was barely above a whisper. Celeste, this is bad. But Celeste refused to believe it. This wasn't how the game worked. She controlled the narrative. She dictated who stayed and who left. And yet, she was the one being erased. Back in the main hall, Shaq put his phone away. He had done enough. Now, he just had to wait. Celeste, pale and visibly shaken, stormed out from backstage, phone glued to her ear, voice sharp as she hissed into the speaker. What do you mean they pulled the campaign? I'm the face of that brand. A pause. Her agency's voice was cold, unapologetic. Not anymore. She froze mid-step, as if the world had tilted. The call went dead. The final crack shattered. Annabelle rushed after her. Celeste, we can fix this. Celeste could barely think. Everything was unraveling too fast. She turned to the models who had been laughing with her moments ago, the ones who had always followed her lead. But something terrifying happened. They were looking at her differently now. Not as a queen, as a liability. Because in this world, power was borrowed, not owned, and Celeste had just defaulted on her debt. And Shaq? He had just bought her entire kingdom without spending a single dollar. Celeste stood there, still clutching her phone as the world moved on without her. And across the room, Shawnee finally caught Shaq's gaze. She didn't know what he had done, didn't know how carefully he had orchestrated the perfect corporate takedown. But she did know one thing. Celeste would never forget this night. And tomorrow, when she woke up to a career in freefall, she'd know exactly who had made it happen. Shaq didn't need to look at her, didn't need to acknowledge her existence. Because kings don't concern themselves with fallen queens. Backstage had never been this quiet before. The once lively space, filled with models adjusting their gowns, stylists fussing over last-minute details, and assistants scrambling to keep everything on schedule, now felt like a graveyard. The air was thick, suffocating, uneasy. A handful of the biggest names in the fashion industry stood in small clusters, their phones clutched in their hands, scrolling through news articles that were updating in real time. Panic was slowly setting in, creeping up their perfectly postured spines. The models who had laughed at Shawnee earlier now weren't laughing at all. Celeste Laurent sat stiffly on a leather chair, eyes flicking from one nervous face to another. She had spent years controlling rooms like this, but tonight, the room was slipping out of her grasp. Something was wrong. Something big. And then, the call came in. A voice, curt and urgent, echoed from the entrance. "Everyone in here. Now." No further explanation. No time for objections. When the people who run the industry tell you to move, you move. And they did. They were led down a dimly lit hallway, each step slower than the last, their heels clicking against the polished floors. The weight of uncertainty pressed on their shoulders, making the designer dresses feel like chains instead of status symbols. Celeste's hands curled into fists as she exchanged a glance with Annabelle, who looked equally lost. What the hell was going on? As they neared the meeting room, they heard whispers from event staff standing off to the side. Does she know yet? She has no clue. This is about to be brutal. A cold chill crawled up Celeste's spine. The doors to the private meeting lounge swung open, and there, standing in the middle of the room, hands in his pockets, completely at ease, was Shaquille O'Neal. The moment they saw him, the entire room turned to stone. Shaq didn't speak right away. He let the silence do the work. Let them sit in their own fear. Let them feel the weight of what they didn't yet fully understand. It was a tactic he had mastered over the years, because silence, it was louder than any outburst ever could be. The event organizer cleared his throat, clearly sweating bullets. Mr. O'Neal, sir, Shaq didn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on Celeste. She had spent the entire night mocking his wife, spitting out insults like they were harmless, disposable things. But now she was the one being watched, judged, weighed, and found wanting. Celeste, for the first time in years, felt small. Shaq finally spoke. "I always love meeting my employees in person." Silence. Crushing, absolute silence. A pin could have dropped, and it would have sounded like a bomb. Celeste's breath caught in her throat. Wait, what? She forced a laugh, a thin, shaky thing. What do you mean? Shaq's expression didn't change. His voice, however, dropped to something lower, something dangerous. It's simple, you work for me. The walls of Celeste's reality started cracking. Her lips parted slightly, her brain desperately trying to process what had just been said. No, that couldn't be right. She had been in this industry for a decade. She had climbed her way to the top. She had power, influence, status, and yet, she had just insulted the man who ran the entire operation. Her stomach dropped. The event organizer tried to jump in, his voice strained with panic. Mr. O'Neal, Shaq, this is a misunderstanding. Shaq turned his head slightly, and the man shut up immediately. He didn't have to tell them to be quiet. They just knew. Annabelle looked around desperately. Wait, I don't understand. How is this? Shaq exhaled slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. Then he dropped the final hammer. You see, Celeste. He took a step forward, towering over her without even trying. I don't just fund this show, I own it. Everything stopped. Celeste felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had spent the night mocking the wife of the man who controlled the very industry she thrived in. She had burned a bridge she didn't even know she was standing on. Annabelle inhaled sharply beside her, the horror finally dawning on her as well. Celeste opened her mouth, desperate to salvage the moment, to regain control. Shaq, it was a joke, It's Mr. O'Neal to you. The room froze again. The way he said it, so calm, so final, made it very clear that there was no conversation to be had. No undoing what had been done. Celeste knew in that moment that she had just lost everything. Phones buzzed. More updates, more contracts pulled. Celeste had been one of the highest paid models in the industry. Now she was a liability. Brands that once fought for her were quietly removing her name from their rosters. Agencies were distancing themselves, unwilling to risk being associated with her name. She felt like she was watching her career slip through her fingers in real time. And the worst part? Shaq never raised his voice. Never had to. Celeste wanted to fight. She wanted to argue, scream, make someone fix this. But there was no fixing this. Not when the person she had crossed was the one holding all the cards. She had spent years underestimating people, believing she was untouchable, irreplaceable, immortal in this industry. And tonight, she learned the truth. No one was untouchable. Not even her. As she turned to leave, eyes burning, throat tight, she risked one last glance at Shawnee. Shawnee wasn't smug. She wasn't gloating. She simply looked at peace. Because Celeste had tried to reduce her to a joke, a footnote, an outsider. But now, Celeste was the one being erased. The meeting ended. The models dispersed, shaken, whispering. Shaq stayed behind, unmoving. His job was done. The industry would handle the rest. And Celeste? She walked out of that room knowing one thing for certain. She would never walk into a room like this again. It started with whispers. Just a few murmurs backstage, a couple of cautious glances exchanged between assistants and managers checking their phones. But in the digital age, whispers had a way of turning into a deafening roar overnight. By the time the Orion Fashion Gala ended and the last champagne glass was set down, the world outside had already shifted. The first tweets appeared at 1:04 a.m. By 1:30 a.m., the hashtags were trending. By sunrise, Celeste Laurent wasn't just the most talked-about model in the industry. She was its biggest cautionary tale. The video was short, brutal, and damning. Someone had captured it all. Celeste's cruel laughter, her smug tone, the way she had belittled Shawnee Henderson like she was a punchline instead of a person. And now, the internet was having its turn. Cancelled Celeste surged to the top of social media, followed closely by Ha Karma in heels and Mean Girls Get Dropped. A thread exposing Celeste's years of elitist, backhanded comments resurfaced within hours. Every old interview, every offhand remark that had once been brushed off as playful arrogance was now being picked apart under a harsher lens. She had built her brand on being untouchable. Now, she was public enemy number one. Corporations didn't care about loyalty. They cared about optics, money, survival. And Celeste? She was now a financial liability. By mid-morning, the damage control meetings had already started. Not for her, but about her. Executives at Axel Cosmetics, one of her biggest sponsors, were the first to move. The brand had made billions by promoting diversity, inclusivity, and empowerment. They couldn't afford to be associated with someone who represented the exact opposite. At 9:15 a.m., their official account posted a carefully worded statement. Axel Cosmetics stands for inclusivity and respect. Effective immediately, we are terminating all partnerships with Celeste Laurent. It was quick, clean, merciless, and it set off a chain reaction. By 11 a.m., a second brand, Soleil Fashion, announced it was removing Celeste from its upcoming campaign. By noon, a third sponsor followed. Then a fourth. Celeste Laurent was being erased in real time. In Times Square, a massive digital billboard that had displayed Celeste's face just hours ago flickered and went dark. When it came back on, she was gone. At magazine stands across the city, last-minute calls were made to replace upcoming covers featuring her. Some were redesigned completely, others simply chose someone else. Her world wasn't just crumbling, it was vanishing. Celeste wasn't stupid. She knew how scandals worked. She had seen it happen to others. And she had always believed that if she was ever caught in one, she would be too big to fall. But now, she was learning just how fast power can slip through your fingers. By early afternoon, her PR team had assembled in full crisis mode. Emails were sent, calls were made, a draft apology was written, tweaked, rewritten, scrapped, rewritten again. At 3:45 p.m., Celeste finally posted her first response. I deeply regret my words and actions. They do not reflect my true values, and I am committed to learning and growing from this experience. It was generic, uninspired, lifeless. Everything people hated about celebrity apologies. The internet tore it apart. Girl, you regret getting caught. That's it. You had true values for exactly how long? 12 hours? If you were really sorry, you wouldn't have laughed in her face last night. The damage was done. Celeste wasn't just losing endorsements. She was losing people. The same models who had sat beside her, who had laughed along with her, were now nowhere to be found. Annabelle? Silent. Other industry friends? Posting vague messages about kindness and respect, distancing themselves without saying her name. Even her own agency? They had stopped taking her calls. She had spent years making other people feel small. And now? She had never felt smaller. At 6 p.m., Celeste's phone rang. For a split second, hope flickered in her chest. Maybe someone had changed their mind. Maybe there was a way out. But the voice on the other end was cold, distant, absolute. Celeste, we're letting you go. She gripped the phone tighter. Wait, no, you can't. It's not our decision anymore. It was over. Her agency was dropping her. And with that call, the last piece of her empire crumbled. Shaq never checked social media. He didn't need to. He already knew how this would play out. He sat in a private lounge, sipping his drink, phone face down on the table beside him. He had made a few moves, a few calls, set the wheels in motion. The rest? The world had done for him. Shawnee sat across from him, watching him with quiet understanding. You didn't say a word. Shaq finally smiled. Didn't need to. Because real power doesn't argue. Real power just moves. And tonight? Celeste Laurent had learned that lesson the hard way. Celeste Laurent had spent her entire career dictating the rules, deciding who was relevant, who was disposable, who deserved to sit at the table, and who didn't belong in the room at all. But tonight, she was the one knocking on doors that wouldn't open. She had been calling her agency for the past 3 hours, trying every contact she had. No one answered. Emails went unanswered. Texts were left unread. She wasn't being ignored. She was being erased. Her face was already disappearing from campaigns. Sponsorships were dropping her name from their websites, and her social media accounts, once flooded with adoration, were now a war zone of backlash. And in the middle of it all, one undeniable truth settled deep in her chest. Shaquille O'Neal had done this, and he hadn't even needed to say a word. The gala had ended hours ago, but the hotel's private lounge was still occupied by one man, larger than life, seated like a king on his throne. Shaq sat back in a leather chair, relaxed, unworried, as if he had all the time in the world. A glass of whiskey rested on the table beside him, untouched. He wasn't here to celebrate. He was simply waiting for what he already knew was coming. And then, the doors opened. Celeste stormed inside. Gone was the untouchable queen who had once commanded every room she walked into. The arrogance was gone. The superiority was gone. What stood before Shaq now was a woman unraveling, clinging desperately to the last threads of a career slipping through her fingers. Shaq, please just hear me out. She stopped short when his eyes met hers. No warmth, no anger, just an unbearable, suffocating stillness. For the first time in her life, Celeste Laurent felt afraid. She swallowed hard, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. This is a misunderstanding, she said quickly. You know how these things get blown out of proportion. The internet loves to twist things, to make villains out of people who don't deserve it. Shaq didn't respond. She took a step closer, heart pounding in her chest. It was a joke, okay? I wasn't trying to be cruel. You know how this industry works. We tease, we play around. It's part of the culture. Still, nothing. Her hands trembled at her sides. He wasn't saying a word. He was just watching. Celeste had built her career on attention. She thrived on reactions, laughter, envy, admiration. Even hatred was better than indifference. But Shaq's silence, it was devastating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Shaq leaned forward. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a lion that already knew its prey couldn't run. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, dangerous, absolute. You think you're powerful because people listen to you? Celeste froze. His gaze never wavered, never softened. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. The words landed like a hammer. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead, to defend herself. But there was nothing to say. Because in that moment, she knew it was true. Shaq didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He simply stood up. Celeste instinctively stepped back, the size difference between them more intimidating than ever. Shaq towered over her, his expression unreadable, his presence suffocating in its finality. Then the final blow. Don't ever speak my wife's name again. And just like that, he turned and walked away. No glance back. No final words. Nothing. Celeste stood frozen, breath shallow, staring at the spot where he had just been. And in that moment she understood. She wasn't just canceled. She was forgotten. The next morning, the final nail in the coffin arrived. Her modeling agency, the one that had made her famous, the one that had backed her for over a decade, released an official statement. We do not tolerate behavior that contradicts our values. Effective immediately, we have terminated our contract with Celeste Laurent. That was it. No farewell. No thank you for her years of work. Just a single sentence wiping away everything she had built. And the worst part? No one cared. She checked her phone again. No messages, no calls. She wasn't just being removed from the industry. She was being replaced. Already, new models were stepping up, filling the space she had once occupied. New faces were on covers. New names were trending. And Celeste Laurent? She was just another scandal in the industry's history. Shaq and Shawnee sat in a quiet restaurant, away from the chaos. Shawnee stirred her coffee, glancing at her husband with a small smile. You didn't have to say much. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Didn't have to. Because true power doesn't scream. True power doesn't beg for respect. It just moves. And now? Celeste was nothing more than a ghost. The fashion world moved fast, but never this fast. It had been less than a week since the collapse of Celeste Laurent, and already the industry had reshaped itself, shifting like a living organism adjusting to the removal of a toxic presence. For years, Celeste had been at the top, the queen of exclusivity, the untouchable icon, the one who dictated who was in and who was out. But when the curtains fell, when the cameras turned away, there was nothing left. Now, the very same industry that had once worshipped her presence was celebrating her absence. And at the center of it all, Shawnee Henderson. Just days ago, Shawnee had been a target. The woman who didn't belong, the one they had whispered about, laughed at, insulted in broad daylight. Now, she was everywhere. The same publications that had once ignored her were now featuring her name in headlines. Editorials hailed her as the epitome of quiet strength. Fashion critics analyzed her style, praising her grace. Designers, the same ones who had stayed silent when she was being mocked, were suddenly reaching out, offering exclusive pieces from their collections. The irony wasn't lost on Shawnee. She didn't need validation. She had never wanted their approval in the first place. But this was a reckoning. Because it wasn't just about her. It was about every woman who had ever been dismissed, belittled and disrespected by people who mistook cruelty for power. And now, the tables had turned. The industry was learning a brutal lesson. Character mattered. For years, people had put up with models like Celeste, ones who built their careers on attitude rather than actual talent, who treated the runway like a battlefield instead of a craft, who survived not because they were the best, but because they were the loudest. That era was over. A new wave of models was already rising, ones who actually deserved to be there. The shift was undeniable. Social media had started highlighting fresh faces, models who had been overshadowed for years, but were finally getting their due. Interviews surfaced of young women speaking about hard work, respect, and humility, a direct contrast to the elitist toxicity that had dominated the industry for too long. Fashion Week schedules were adjusted overnight. Brands that had once prioritized attitude over ability were now choosing talent over arrogance. One by one, the old ways were being dismantled. Not everyone adapted fast enough. Some brands had hesitated when Celeste's downfall began, unsure of where to place their loyalty. They had tried to wait it out, thinking the backlash would fade, that Celeste might recover. They had been wrong. By the time they finally severed ties, it was too late. Their indecision had already been noticed, and the public, especially social media, had a long memory. Boycotts started. Campaigns failed before they even launched. Investors pulled out. They had backed the wrong queen. And now, they were paying the price. The message was crystal clear. Power without respect is nothing. Celeste had built an empire, but it had no foundation. The moment people stopped fearing her, she had nothing left. Shawnee, on the other hand, had never needed to demand respect. She simply carried herself with it. And that was the difference. Because true power isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting yourself up without needing to crush anyone in the process. Shaq and Shawnee sat in a quiet, upscale restaurant, away from the noise of the industry, the cameras, the headlines. Shawnee scrolled through her phone, seeing article after article about the fall of fashion's mean girl culture and the rise of models with real talent. She glanced up at her husband. "You didn't have to do all that, you know." Shaq smirked, sipping his drink. "Didn't do much. The industry just needed a reminder of who runs things." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "I still can't believe how fast it all happened." Shaq set his glass down and leaned back. "That's the thing about power, Shawnee." He looked at her, calm and steady. "It only lasts as long as people let you have it." And Celeste? They weren't letting her have it anymore. Shaquille O'Neal had never been a man who needed to announce his victories. He had been underestimated his whole life, dismissed as too big, too slow, too different. And yet, here he was, a billionaire, a businessman, a household name, respected, untouchable. He had learned long ago that real power wasn't in shouting or proving people wrong with words. It was in actions, in the quiet, unstoppable force of influence. And tonight, he hadn't needed to raise his voice. The world had spoken for him. The headlines hadn't stopped. News outlets were calling it the night the fashion industry changed forever. Social media was flooded with posts dissecting the fall of Celeste Laurent, not just as a scandal, but as a symbol of a shifting era. Commentators, journalists, and industry insiders all had the same takeaway. Respect is more powerful than status. Character outlasts arrogance. Shaq saw it all, but he didn't react. He didn't need to. Winning wasn't about celebrating someone else's downfall. It was about standing so tall that no one could knock you down in the first place. Shawnee sat across from him in their quiet lounge, sipping her tea, her expression thoughtful. "She'll never recover from this," she said softly. Did you mean to destroy her?" Shaq shook his head. "I don't destroy people." He looked out at the city skyline, the lights blinking like distant stars. "I just remind them who's really in charge." Celeste had made her choices. She had chosen cruelty over kindness, arrogance over grace. Shaq had simply let her own choices catch up to her. In the days that followed, the shift became undeniable. Fashion brands rebranded their campaigns, pushing for models who actually deserved to be there. Industry executives made quiet changes behind closed doors, reassessing the kind of people they wanted to represent them. People would remember this night, not because a model lost her career, but because a new standard was set. And Shaq? He didn't have to say a word. His legacy spoke for itself. True influence isn't about fame. It's about what remains when the spotlight fades. The world rewards those who lead with respect, resilience, and quiet strength, and erases those who build their power on borrowed fear. In a world obsessed with status, remember what truly lasts. Because the real giants, they don't just win, they redefine the game. Are you building a moment or a legacy?